If we look at the federal government under the RCRA, Resource Conservation Recovery Act, they took all of their compliance requirements and they put them in regulations. So if I want to see what I need to do if I generate hazardous waste, I can go to 40 CFR and look through the code sections that deal with hazardous waste, and all of the requirements are there in regulation. But we know California does not operate that way, do they? So we have stuff in Title 22, those are our regulations, but we also have the California Health and Safety Code. And sometimes things are put into law. Now the idea of the law is it should be very general in telling you, the importance of what it is doing, and the regulation should be specific on how to do it. That's how the federal government works. California does not work that way. A lot of times they will write such detail in the laws that they never bother to write it in regulation. So it makes it hard to find the stuff. If you got a copy of Title 22 and you want to look at what can I do in recycling, you will have very little information because almost all of the information for recycling is found in the Health and Safety Code. Do you guys want to carry around a bunch of binders that have all the codes when you're out doing inspections? Or how about one little handy handout or guide from a presentation? I've taken all of the federal, the state requirements, laws, and put them into one document. So if you get an issue that's dealing with recycling, you have all that information available to you. Simple. So if you guys don't have this, I recommend that go to the website, download it, and either print it off or have it saved. But it's good to have a copy. In the old days, going old school, when I first started doing this, the DTSC would print out all of our presentations. And it was boxes and boxes of paper. It's very unwieldy to deal with all that paper. But one of the nice things out of it on classes like this that provide reference material, you would take that away and you would have that document. And you could write notes on. Because sometimes the stuff I put up here is kind of like brief, and then you would want to add your additional notes. So you guys can take notes, but it would be nice if it was on the document. Then you have your notes and the document all on one. So we don't have that anymore. When I was an inspector, I would take these documents out with me, and if I ever ran into these issues, I would pull it out. For years and years, I taught tiered permitting for the CUPA conference. Anybody ever gone to my tiered permitting class with Steve Lichten? Yeah. So you remember how thick that document was that we handed out. It was almost a book. But it was valuable information if you were dealing with a facility and you're auditing their tiered permitting requirements. All right, so wanted to make sure I touched on that. I think we're good to go. So we'll go ahead and get started. What are our objectives out of this class? We want to provide general overview of recycling exemptions, exclusions for hazardous waste. And kind of what's the difference between an exclusion and an exemption? Exclusions are, and they get muddled sometimes, but exclusions are supposed to be automatic. Exemptions are supposed to be conditional. So if I'm excluded, I don't have to do anything, I'm just out. If I'm exempted, I have to follow something or I can lose that exemption. That's kind of the idea that they're supposed to be. We want to increase your understanding of differences between RCRA and non-RCRA hazardous waste recycling requirements and conditions. Provide you with information on resources and guidance, so that's where the document really comes into play. And give you confidence to identify authorized recycling from sham recycling. So you people that are business, I'm going to give you methods to recycle. And I'm going to tell you the best way to do that. What are the best exemptions for you to use? Why? And then as an inspector, I'm going to tell you what is allowed, what to look for when people are claiming to use a recycling exemption. Inspecting for over 20 years, I tell you that businesses think that because they recycle, they can do whatever they want. They go, well, it's recycled. Okay, but you still have to do all these additional things. They think once it's recycled, it's not regulated, and that's not the case. So, references, resources, citations, definitions, interpretations, explanations are critical. Remember, some recycling rules, exemptions, and exclusions apply to both RCRA and non-RCRA waste. Some federal RCRA exemptions or exclusions apply only to RCRA. Others apply only to non-RCRA. And we'll take a look at what you're doing with the material can affect its classification. So if you do a waste determination and it's a RCRA hazardous waste, you have to look at what you're doing. What you're doing may make it a non-RCRA waste. And then what you're allowed to do to it may open up. So just because something is RCRA waste doesn't mean it's going to necessarily stay there. If you do certain activities, there's a certain RCRA waste and you do this, it's not a RCRA waste anymore. California says it's still a waste and they want it regulated as a California waste. So we'll take a look at that. Applying a recycling exemption to a particular set of facts is often unclear. Often must rely on definitions and interpretations. They can be subjective. Who has authority over waste determination? The DTSC has authority, not the CUPAs. So if it's a waste determination, if they have to determine, is my waste a hazardous waste, the CUPAs cannot do that. In other words, they would have to almost like submit a petition to the state and say that I feel my waste is not a hazardous waste. The state can make a determination. It's very complex, but if you want to do a certain type of recycling, it may go to the state to determine whether that is allowed or not. And again, not everything's black and white. It can be gray. One small detail can change the whole thing. So it's very important how, not only what it is, but what you are doing with it. And there are exceptions to exclusions. So it's excluded unless, or if you do something, it may go away. Statute and regs are quite complex, and the regulations typically are written more in a general language, whereas the law is written more in legalese. It's written by attorneys, right? So if our recycling exemptions and exclusions are found in the California Health and Safety Code, which is law, they're written in legalese, not in general language. So it can be confusing just to read it. So we're going to do a haz waste review. I love this. Simplicity. The simplest solutions are often the cleverest. They can also be wrong. So we'll take a look at, is my waste a hazardous waste? If I have a waste and it's not being discarded, it's not a waste. It's very important that we understand what a hazardous waste is, because we're only dealing with hazardous waste recycling in this class, not general recycling. So we need to know what a hazardous waste is. For something to be a hazardous waste, it must be a waste. So if it's not being discarded, it's not a waste. Specific blanket regulatory exclusions, exemptions, it's not going to be a waste. And then some other blanket regulatory exclusions, exemptions, it's a waste, but it may not be a hazardous waste. So if it's still a waste and you're doing certain things, it may not be a hazardous waste. If I have a waste, I make a waste determination, it's not listed, it's not characteristic, it's not a hazardous waste. If it's not a hazardous waste, then it's not subject to hazardous waste rules. Straightforward, right? You would be surprised the number of facilities I see managing non-hazardous waste under hazardous waste rules. Why are they doing that? Because they never bothered to make a good waste determination. But if that's not the case, hazardous waste, if it's specifically RCRA, non-RCRA, direct use, reuse in a process, or as a raw material substitute, and we're going to get into these in details, it's not a waste. And certain reclamation for non-RCRA waste, not a waste. And then other ones, you are doing reclamation, but it's allowed, but it's still a waste. Why is it important to know whether it's a waste or not? If I'm a large quantity generator and I'm storing my waste in a tank, then I need to meet certain tank requirements, right? But if that material is not a hazardous waste, or it's not a waste, then I don't have to meet those requirements. It costs a lot of money to meet the tank requirements. They have to hire a qualified, independent California professional engineer to assess their tanks. But if it's not a waste, they don't have to do that. So if they can end up over here and not here, they're going to save a lot of money by not having to have that tank assessed. And by the way, you got to do it every 5 years, so it's not a one-time deal. So there's a lot of requirements that come into play, whether it ends up here or ends up there. ERM stands for excluded recyclable material. So those are our ERMs. We'll see that throughout the presentation. So feds versus California. Federal waste we can find in 40 CFR, parts 261 and 260. Non-RCRA. Fortunately, California kind of adopted the federal numbering system. They just put a 66 in front of it. So you can see how things match up between the feds and state. However, California added stuff in the California Health and Safety Code. So regulated by US EPA, regulated by California. Some federal exemption exclusions not shared, partially shared by California, and some exemptions exclusions only applicable to non-RCRA waste. And slight difference between corrosivity and the characteristics. Other than that, California is in toxicity. Other differences, RCRA has waste and exemption definitions and criteria. They're all in 40 CFR under the feds. In California, we've got them in a variety of places. But they're all in this presentation. So again, the importance of having a copy of the presentation. Exemptions and exclusions applicable to non-RCRA waste and RCRA waste in California, mostly in Health and Safety Code, but there's a few in definitions and in 261 or 66261. Importance of RCRA versus non-RCRA classification and regulation as related to exclusions and exemptions. How many of you guys ever go in and look at seeing what's excluded? Yeah, very good. You need to take a look at that. If you don't know what's excluded, you might be applying requirements to materials that don't need to be regulated. So waste and activities that are RCRA exempt excluded might not all be exempted or excluded by California. California is a very unique state. It has a lot of its own requirements. So our exemptions, 266.261.4, and then we've got several different ones listed here. Materials that are not waste in Section A. Materials or waste which are not hazardous waste is in B. Hazardous waste generated but not yet removed from processes or transport equipment. So you can't call something a hazardous waste if it is in a process unit. Even if it's sitting in the process unit, it's not until it comes out. That makes sense, right? If it's in a pipeline, it's not a waste until it comes out of the pipeline. If it's in a tank, it's not a waste until it comes out of the tank. An example is there are K-listed wastes for tank bottoms of fuel. So if I'm a refinery and I have tanks that I'm storing gasoline in, over a period of time it will build a sludge at the bottom. As a regulator, it can't go in and say, oh, you've got sludge in there. How long have you been storing that? Past 90 days? Oh, you're over the accumulation time. It doesn't apply until that material comes out of the tank, regardless of how long it's been sitting in the tank. Seems kind of counterintuitive, right? It's a waste material, it's in the tank sitting there. But that is not a waste tank, that's a process tank. And it's being generated in that unit. The point of generation is when it comes out of the tank. We've got samples sent for analysis and treatability studies, that's D through F, and controlled substances. Yes, I got a question.
What you were just speaking of, when certain generate permits to dispose of their waste through like industrial permit through the
POTW?
is that true what you were saying about it becoming a waste when it exits that pipeline or whatever?
So she's asking what is the point of generation on something? It's a good topic, and there is a class that looks specifically at when the point of generation is. If you have a unit that is treating something, you have to look at the effluent that's going into the unit. So if you're treating a waste, and the waste that's going into the unit is non-hazardous waste, then it's not a hazardous waste treatment unit, it's just a treatment unit. However, if the effluent that's going into the treatment unit is a hazardous waste, then that unit is going to be regulated as a hazardous waste treatment unit. So that's the easiest way to look at it. But what C is looking at are process units. Let's say I have an air filtration system, and it has a bag in there, and it collects whatever bad stuff is in the air, and over a period of time that bag is going to get full, right? It's not a waste in the unit, correct? It's a product. At some point in time, you're going to want to take that bag out. When you take it out, at that point it becomes a waste, right? We all agree on that. So that would be the point when you do a waste determination. So you would have to take a look. The stuff that the bag has collected, is that a hazardous waste? If it is, then you would have to manage it as hazardous waste. But in the unit, the first drop that goes into the bag or the first gram of material in the bag, that's not the accumulation start date. The accumulation start date is when it comes out of the process unit. So both the EPA and the state don't regulate materials in a process unit. And if a tank is a storage unit for a product, you wouldn't count any waste until it came out of the tank. So that's the point of generation. Some of the blanket statutory exemptions, there's a lot of them. Domestic sewage, irrigation return flows, certain in situ mining waste left in place. You know, if you're mining stuff out, there's all kinds of metals in that ore, right? Are you going to run a T-clip or an STLC on mining waste for metals when that's what you're trying to get out of the ground? It's an ore, it's rich in metals. You know, so there are some exemptions for that. Certain spent wood preserving solutions, if you're trying to reclaim those, specific coking and other petroleum industry waste. You know, this is basically having a lot of pull, being a large industry. They've gone to the EPA and the state and say, we need an exemption because of what we're doing, the type of business. So you'll see a lot of exemptions that relate to the petroleum industry. Both California and RCRA exclusions. The big one is the 66261.4, industrial wastewater point source discharges. What's that? An NPDES permit. That's a federal permit to discharge waters to the state. So if I am a power plant and I use water for cooling at my power plant, it's going to run through my system, and then where am I going to send it? I'm going to send it back into waters of the state, either directly into the ocean or into a river that dumps into the ocean, right? We've seen that. So they have a permit to do that. They have to meet those permit guidelines. If you follow those guidelines, you don't have to do a waste determination. But there's no way that that material would be a hazardous waste because they wouldn't allow it to be discharged into a body of water. The criteria is much more stringent than what it takes to be a hazardous waste. Nuclear materials. How come EPA in the state does not regulate nuclear materials as hazardous waste? They were already regulated when EPA came along by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the NRC, right? So it's already regulated. They're not going to regulate it as hazardous waste. They have their own rules to follow. So nuclear waste is not, or radioactive waste is not hazardous waste. What happens when you take a recra waste and you contaminate it with radioactive waste? That's a mixed waste. So by definition, a mixed waste is radioactive and recra waste mixed together. And that's a mess. You've really got problems. Spent sulfuric acid used to make sulfuric acid. In making sulfuric acid, you're going to get a byproduct. That byproduct would meet the criteria of being a hazardous waste. But they went to them and said, we can feed this back into the process and make more sulfuric acid from it, so we don't want it to be regulated as a hazardous waste. It kind of handcuffs them on how they are allowed to handle that material, so that's a specific exclusion. Pulping liquors. What are pulping liquors? It doesn't have anything to do with bars. Paper manufacturing. Very big, right? So paper or pulping liquors being reclaimed. They're excluded from being a waste. So not a waste, it can't be a hazardous waste. Makes sense. It's almost like an intermittent product, material for producing a product. Secondary materials that are reclaimed and returned to the original generating process. That's very similar to what these two things are. They're taking a byproduct of their process and putting it back into the process. Seems reasonable to be excluded from being a waste, right? Do we agree with that? Does that make sense? You guys aren't against that, right? That seems fair? All right. I always say the giggle test. If I say something and it doesn't sound right and you guys giggle, then that's bad, right? So it should make sense. It should pass the giggle test. So reclamation process is completely enclosed. Reclamation does not involve controlled flame, combustion, materials not accumulated in tanks greater than 1 year without reclamation, and not used as a fuel or UCD, use constituting disposal. So this is another term that we'll talk about. What is use constituting disposal? EPA said if you do these things, you call recycling or reclamation, we call it disposal. So you don't get a recycling exemption or exclusion if what you're doing is basically disposal. So no exclusion, no exemption. Yes, question?
What if it's a fuel to begin with?
She's asking, what is it a fuel to begin with? And we'll get into more details, but since you asked, if it's being used for its original intended use. So you're not allowed to take your waste and burn them for energy unless your waste is a fuel, because you're always allowed to use it for its original intended use. If it was built to be a fuel and you're reclaiming it to use it as a fuel, then that was its intended use. So if I have gasoline and it's gone bad and I reclaim it and then I burn it as a fuel, that's not sham. That passes the giggle test, right? That's not some kind of sham con game that you got going on. All you did is you took a fuel that was off spec, and you made it so that you could use it. So that's kind of one of the exemptions for that.
Is there another stipulation on that the material has to be completely under the use of the generating company or generator?
That it has to be used on site?
Or that the generator has to have complete control of the process?
It might be in a different one. I don't think under this one, but I have the regulations with me. We'll take a look and see at the break time if there's any additional one on here. I don't think so. All right, so we'll move forward. These are materials excluded from being a waste. If it's not a waste, it's not a hazardous waste. These are excluded from being a hazardous waste. Retro exclusions, there's a lot. They're also in 261.4B, things like household waste, mining overburden, ash, fly and bottom ash, flue gas emission control waste, drilling fluids, produced waters, and other waste associated with exploration, development, and production of crude oil. Again, you know, the oil companies are going to the EPA and saying, if you regulate this stuff, it's going to hamper our production. And they have such big lobbyists in Washington that they can get exemptions just for their industry. Wouldn't it be great if you could go and get an exemption for your little industry and not be regulated as a waste or as a hazardous waste? Wouldn't that be nice? No? You guys don't agree? I think it would be good. Very specific chrome waste, very specific T-clip, toxic UST, oily remediation waste, and there's a few others. Waste excluded from being classified as a hazardous waste, both California and RCRA exclusions, infectious animal carcasses. It sounds bad, right? But it's not regulated as a hazardous waste. It could be a medical waste or an infectious waste, but it's not a hazardous waste. Used oil refining distillation bottoms used as asphalt feedstock. Who do you think got this one? Oil industry again. Specific ore and mineral extraction process and beneficiation waste and slags, the mining industry. And used HVAC, CFCs that are being reclaimed for further use, and there's a few others. So what is a waste? A waste is this is like Haz Waste 101. But it's good to do a little refresher on what makes something a waste. Any discarded material that is not excluded. So if it's not excluded from being a waste and it's discarded, then it is a waste. So what does discarded mean? It means it's relinquished. What does that word mean? When we're talking about relinquished, what are we talking about? You're giving it up. You're basically giving your rights up to it. Think about this. If the police wants information on something in your house, they need a warrant to go into your house, right? So they have to go to a judge, and they have to ask the judge for permission to go into your house, and they got to sell it pretty good. They can't say, well, the guy hasn't shaved in weeks, so that's not a crime. Well, he looked at me funny. Nah, that doesn't work. They got to get something to the judge that basically is, the judge is going to give up that person's rights to their privacy and say, okay, you can go inside their place. But if that person takes something and puts it in the trash, do they still have a right to privacy on stuff that went to the trash? If I was a police officer, would I need a warrant to steal their trash, to look in their trash? No, we don't. Why? Because they have relinquished their rights. So that's basically what you're doing. You're relinquishing what you want from that material. It's not a product anymore. It's something that you don't want. Now, it may not have left your facility yet, but I want you to kind of think of it's destined to be disposed of. So that's relinquished. Look at this, recycled. So if it's being recycled, it's a waste. Why is that? Is it a product? It's not a product, right? Once it's been recycled, it might be something different. But before it's being recycled, it's going to be considered a waste. Because there's something about it that makes it not a product. So if it's not a product, what is it? In this case, it's going to be a waste. Poses a health or environmental threat. These are great as inspectors because if you go to a facility and you're looking and they have containers that have no labels on them, how safe is that to have a hazardous material without a label? Does it sound safe? No. So they actually say if you don't have a label on there, you don't value it anymore and you're relinquishing it. It's being discarded. How about if it's in a damaged container? Is it at risk of harming somebody or harming the environment? So you don't seem to care about it, so you're treating it like it was a waste. So these are things that can make something a waste. It was a product because the label fell off, now it can be a waste, or because I hit it with the forklift and damaged the container, it could be a waste now. And then the last one, inherently waste-like. And these are EPA wrote regulations for materials that have dioxins in them. If you recycle them, they are still a waste until they're actually used. So that's what they mean by inherently waste-like. Even though they are a product, they're nervous about the use of those materials. And I had a question. So he's asking about the limits. This makes it tough. If I go out as an inspector and I see there's a container that doesn't have a label on it, they have 10 days to do that. You could ask them, how long has this container not had a label on it? And they go, oh, it hasn't had a label on it for months. That's a violation. But if they say, oh, you know what, I think it must have fallen off today. Does that ever happen? So if that's what they're telling you, can you write them a violation for that? But can you come back 10 days later, and if it's in the same condition, now it's a violation because it's a waste. Are they managing it like a waste? If they don't have a waste label and an accumulation date on it, then you can write them a violation. I got a question in the back?
Is that a line in the statute or the regs?
That is in, this is all in Title 22. This is 66261.4 A through E. So actually in the regulations. This is a good one to know. We forget about this one, but this is a powerful tool when you're doing inspections because how often do you go out to a facility and you find a container that's damaged or doesn't have a label on it? So when they wrote the regulations, if it's in a damaged container, they only give it 4 days. Because why? They're more worried about a damaged container than they are a container without a label. This one is at least in a good container. This one, it's a threat to the environment if it's in it. What do I mean by a damaged container? Dented to the point that you've impaired the material that's holding it. So if it's a steel drum and you've actually creased it to the point where you're stretching the metal and causing it to thin out, or if it's rusting to the point that the actual metal is flaking off of the container, that would be a damaged container. I got a question in the back. Can this apply to products? Absolutely, because this is what's making it a waste. We haven't even said in the word hazardous waste, these are just waste. So if I have a product that falls under these things, it can become a waste because it's in a damaged container or because it doesn't have a label on it. What value is a product that they don't even know what it is? So it has to have a label on there. And then we talked about the inherently waste-like. Any questions on dioxins? We don't see them a lot anymore. They wrote these regulations in the 70s, and dioxin was a big issue in the 70s. It's one of the byproducts that you get manufacturing DDT. We don't make a lot of DDT anymore. But at the time, this was a big issue. People forget about this. There's like 10 waste codes that deal with dioxins. So when they put the regs together, sometimes this stuff is a big issue at the time, and then as the years go by, you don't even hear about it much anymore. So relinquished, disposed of, burned or incinerated, accumulated, stored, or treated, either before or in lieu of being disposed, burned, or incinerated. So, this we've all seen these, right? You go out to the back portion of a facility, and here's the containers next to the, old valves that have been there forever and ever. But that's what we mean by relinquished. It's destined for disposal, I think is a good way to sum that up. Recycled. If it's recycled by any of these, it's a waste. So if you're, it's an ingredient in a use-constituting disposal. So if the material's going to the ground, burned for energy recovery, unless that's what it was intended for, being reclaimed. So if it's being reclaimed, it's a waste, except with some exceptions. And being speculatively accumulated. How many people have heard of speculative accumulation? Good. So we're going to go into details on all of these definitions. And again, poses a threat to the environment. Can you guys read that label? I can't read it. In a damaged container, if it's open, if it's rusted. Here's a table. How many people look at this table? Nobody. All right. So this is it's in the regulations. I'm not making this stuff up. It's 66261.2D, Table 1. This is for recycled materials. So use-constituting disposal, it's always a hazardous waste. Energy recovery for fuel, always a hazardous waste. Speculatively accumulated, almost always a hazardous waste. But look at reclamation. Reclamation is different than the other ones. This is basically a federal table that's been reprinted into the California regs. And under reclamation, under these three categories, it's not a federally regulated waste if you reclaim it. So if I start with one of these, it's a RCRA hazardous waste, but I reclaim it, then it is not a RCRA hazardous waste. It's a state-regulated waste only. So we have sludges, and we will define what a sludge is. They have to be characteristic. Can't be a listed sludge. Byproducts, characteristic. So if it's what do I mean by characteristic? Reactive. So they're the four categories. When we talk about hazardous waste, when EPA was putting the regulations together, they came up with 4 characteristics that would make something a hazardous waste. It was either ignitable, it was corrosive, it was reactive, or it was toxic. And then on top of that, they said there's some things that we want to regulate regardless of what the waste is. And those are listed waste. It's based on a characteristic, but you don't have to do any testing to see if it's a hazardous waste. It's a hazardous waste by definition. Okay? That's a listed waste. So when they're talking about a byproduct that's characteristic, it means it cannot be a listed waste. It has to be a characteristic waste only. And then commercial chemical products. And these are listed in 66261.33. Those are for K-listed waste. Those are specific processes. So if you have a commercial chemical product and it's listed in that, it's not a RCRA hazardous waste. So byproducts, sludges, commercial chemical products. Commercial chemical products is like it never was used. It just exceeded its shelf life, or for whatever reason, you decided you didn't want to use it. You could buy a product and then decide, oh, I don't want to use that product. At that point in time, it becomes a waste because you're going to dispose of it, you're relinquishing it, so it becomes a waste. But maybe you could do some recycling or reclamation with it, and it wouldn't be a federal regulated waste, it would only be a California waste. This is important later on. So terms and definitions. Recyclable material, it's a hazardous waste that's capable of being recycled, including a residue, a spent material, a material that is contaminated to the extent that it can no longer be used for the purpose which it was originally purchased or manufactured. It could be a byproduct listed in 261.31 or 32. These are the F. The other one's K. So commercial chemical products were P. So this is F listed and K listed. So point 33 is P listed. Any retrograde material that has not been used, distributed, or reclaimed through treatment by original manufacturer or owner by the later of following dates. 1 year after the date material which became a retrograde material. We'll define what retrograde material is. If the material has been returned to the original manufacturer 1 year after the material is returned to the original manufacturer. So there's still some time limits that things need to be recycled. And so this could be material that's being stored. At some point in time, it may no longer be viable. It doesn't instantly become a waste. You can't go into a facility like this and say, oh, this is all hazardous waste. If it's got a label on it, just because it's been there 20 years doesn't make it a waste. If it's exceeded its shelf life, it may be. So what is a retrograde material? This is a good definition to know. Any hazardous material which is not to be used, sold, or distributed for use in originally intended or prescribed manner or purpose. So what do we mean is the material is not a waste, but it's not being used. Does this ever happen? Yeah, it does. There are companies that have materials that are hazardous, but they don't have any use for them now. There's nothing that makes them a waste. If I'm a plating facility and I have a nickel tank full of nickel, and I was going to plate nickel, but I haven't got any clients that want nickel plated material, and it's been sitting there for years, I'm not using the material. So at some point in time, it's going to become a retrograde material. So it has to meet this criteria, has undergone chemical, biochemical, physical, or other changes due to the passage of time or environmental conditions under which it was stored, has exceeded a specific or recommended shelf life, is banned by law, regulation, ordinance, or decree, and cannot be used for reason of economic, health and safety, or environmental hazard. So if they're not using it for economical reasons, that can make it a waste. It can become a retrograde material. If retrograde materials are not used within a certain time frame, a retrograde material is not a waste yet, but it can be. So as an inspector, you go to a facility and they have the same material time after time, you can ask them, what are you using this for? If they don't have a use for it, it basically becomes a waste. Even if it's got a label on it and it's in a good container. It's away from keeping businesses to store chemicals indefinitely, forever. Yes?
Now that's by the same party, that's not going through to a third party, in other words, giving it to another company to use it?
They can give it to another company. It's going to be managed like a product as long as something is being done with it. It's not a waste yet. So if I have a retrograde material, let's go to my example on my tank with my nickel solution in it that I'm not using. But I know another plater and he's doing all kinds of nickel plating. Can I sell him or give him that material so that he can use it in his tank? Does that seem reasonable? He's gonna, I had that material to plate nickel and I wasn't using it. I found somebody else that's gonna use it to plate nickel onto metal parts. That was its original intended use. So that seems great. But what if that guy is making blueberry muffins and he wants a shiny green color to that, to the blueberry muffins? So would that be a good use of that material for that? It's not its originally intended use. Wasn't for that. So why is he adding nickel to blueberry muffins? Doesn't make sense. I mean, that's an extreme case, but stuff like that happens. So that's the giggle test. You guys are all kind of laughing when I say, nickel and blueberry muffins. It doesn't make sense. So it's not legitimate recycling. But they certainly could manage it like a product because it hasn't become a waste yet. So it would go out on a bill of lading, just like any other hazardous material. Commercial chemical products, the CCPs, for purpose of, is it a listed hazardous waste? It's unused, essentially pure, single active ingredient chemicals. So these are the P's and the U's. For purposes of, am I reclaiming or specifically accumulating a commercial chemical product, and is it therefore a solid waste? All types of unused products such as chemical mixtures, compounds, products, circuit boards. So it's not limited just to these under California. It would be just basically anything regardless of whether they are listed in 66261.33. So it's an unused product though. It's not a spent material, it's not a byproduct. It's just exceeded its shelf life, or you've decided for some reason, economics or whatever, that you don't want to use it. A byproduct is a material that's not one of the primary products of production and is not solely or separately produced by the production process. So it doesn't mean that it has no value. It's just maybe something that you're not trying to produce. So it's a byproduct. I remember we had a facility, they were manufacturing acetylene. And in the manufacturing of acetylene, one of the byproducts is calcium hydroxide. So that was a byproduct of making acetylene. They had to do something with it. They didn't do anything with it, but they could bag that material up and sell it to somebody that does use calcium hydroxide. Recycled, used or unused or reclaimed. Process to recover a usable product or regenerated. So recycled doesn't necessarily mean you're doing anything with it. If it's like an empty container and you reuse it, you've recycled it. But you didn't do anything to it. You just found another purpose for it. If I reclaim it, I'm doing something to it before I can use it. So that's what reclamation is. Used or reused, a material that is either employed as an ingredient, including use as an intermediate or industrial process to make a product. A material does not satisfy this condition if distinct components of the material are recovered as separate end products. So basically, it's not benefiting the production. They're in the process, they're removing those materials. They were not important in the production of that product. employed in a particular function or application as an effective substitute for a commercial chemical product. Effective substitute is the key word on there. If you're using it to make something, it has to be effective. You can't be just adding it to get rid of it. Accumulated speculatively. So accumulating before recycling, unless material is potentially recyclable and has a feasible means of being recycled, and during the calendar year starting January 1st, the amount of material recycled or transferred to a different site for recycling is greater than 75% of the amount accumulated at the beginning of the period. Very important, the period starts January 1st. So if I generate a waste in February, that inventory is not even looked at until we get to January 1st. So at that point, I've got 1 year to recycle it. So if it was December, then the clock starts January 1st, then I've got 1 year. So I've got how long? How many months? 13 months. What if I start in February and then I go to January, how long do I have? Now I've got, 20 months? Yeah, just short of 2 years. So it really matters when you start generating it. As an inspector, you have to look at what was their inventory January 1st, and you have to basically come back the following year and see what they did. A lot of these requirements entail you going back to the facility, right? And what is our prescribed inspection frequency? Every 3 years. So sometimes you need to go back and do follow-ups to make sure these things are happening, and you can't wait the 3 years. So percent turnover is applied to each material of the same type that is recycled in the same way. So each materials are looked at independently. If you had 3 waste streams that you're recycling, each one of those waste streams would be looked at independently. It wouldn't need to be 75% of the total. It would need to be 75% of each. I got a question.
Yeah, I've got a question about speculative accumulation and then broader about the recycling. Because the speculative accumulation rules were changed at the federal level by the 2015 definition of solid waste rule. And so I'm wondering, do you know how that's being implemented in California?
I don't know the status on that right now. So his question is, the federal rules changed in 2015. How does that affect things here in California? California is an authorized state. And being an authorized state, they don't have to immediately implement any changes in the federal rules. They have a time period to implement those. So just because it changes on the Fed, it may not change in California, and I forget what the timeline is on it. It's either 18 months or 12 months they have to make the changes, to adopt or not adopt.
Right, and I'm just curious, do you have any idea on whether they're going to adopt the full changes from the 2015 DSW?
They probably, I wouldn't know. You'd have to ask DTSC. I think they still have a section, Ask DTSC. That's a great question to ask them. Materials already defined as waste don't count. So if it's already a hazardous waste, it's going to fall under those rules, not speculative. This is looking more at either materials to be recycled that are excluded or just products. Materials that have been removed from accumulation for recycling also no longer count. So just an example, I think we kind of talked about this. If you start here by here, you need to have recycled at least 75%. So it's a nice little reminder to have on the slides. When you guys download these or print these, you will have that for you. This was a site where we did an inspection, and the materials were supposed to be recycled, and we went back a year later and none of the materials had been recycled. So we did enforcement on them for storage without a permit, basically. Because it became a waste, it went past the 90 days, then it's storage without a permit. Took some effort though. We had to go out and do the inspection, and then we have to go back like a year later plus 90 days. You know, so it involved several visits, not just one inspection. Inspector issues, when did the accumulation start? So the business has to have pretty good records on their materials. What was the material inventory on January 1st? What was the amount of materials in and out during the year? So they have to keep records of what was being recycled. What does their raw material storage area look like versus a pile of stuff? You know, it should be well organized. And what are they doing with the material? Who has the burden of proof? The generator or the inspector? The generator. If you want to do enforcement, who then has the burden of proof? The inspector. So it's the generator's responsibility, but if you want to do enforcement, you have to be able to prove it. Burden falls on the agency. Use constituting disposal, placed into or onto the land, applied to the land. So use constituting disposal, think of it goes on the ground. If I take my hazardous waste and I find out that it kills weeds, and I go and I spray it on my back area to kill the weeds, and it's a great weed killer. The weeds die, and it's so good, years later, those weeds never come back. Is that an effective weed killer? Did it work? Yeah. But why can't I do that? Because the EPA doesn't want us doing that. So sometimes they write these rules to keep people from doing stuff like that. There's all kinds of chemicals that you could put on weeds that will kill them, right? I mean, it could be toxic, it could be corrosive, it could be ignitable, and it's still going to be a great weed killer. They didn't want to see that. So they made it a rule that it's use constituting disposal, and you have to have a special permit to do that. You could do that, but you're basically like a TSDF. You're not a generator anymore. So that's not a recycling exclusion. Spent material that has been used and as a result of contamination can no longer serve the purpose for which it was produced without processing. And a sludge. Sludge is not a gooey material. It's the byproduct of an air purifying system or air treatment system or a wastewater treatment system. One of those two things. So it could be a dry powder and it could be a sludge. It doesn't have to be gooey liquidy stuff. So is this being applied to the ground? I would say so. So if I had a material that I was using as an ingredient for asphalt, is that being applied to the ground? I would say so. There can be some exemptions for that, but not general across the board exemptions. How about that? Is that being applied to the ground? Okay. Scrap metal, manufactured solid metal objects and products or metal workings, including cuttings, trimmings, stampings, grindings, shavings, or sandings, solid metal residue from metal production, but things that are not scrap metal. Lead acid batteries are not scrap metal. That makes sense. Waste elemental mercury. Why isn't that scrap metal? It's pure metal, right? So what's the deal with mercury? Why is it unique? It's the only metal that's a liquid at standard temperature and pressure. So does that pose a risk to the environment? Sure does. Is mercury toxic? Sure is. Okay, so they didn't want to have mercury as a scrap metal. and anything that's water reactive. There are metals that we don't think of as metals, like metallic sodium. Pure sodium is very water reactive. Sludges. So what do I mean by sludges? That's correct. Those are sludges. Or metals in liquid or solution, or fine powders. And by fine powders, they mean less than 100 microns. That should be a micron, not a U, but I don't think we had one on the computer. Smelting and refining residues, like drosses and slags. Magnesium borings. How come not magnesium borings? What's the hazard with magnesium? So it meets the definition of an ignitable solid, and it's a physical hazard, so they didn't want it being managed by scrap metal, because anybody ever been to a scrap metal facility? Are they neat? Are they well organized? So there's like, no, because if they start a fire, can you put water on a magnesium fire to put it out? It's so hot it breaks the water molecule into hydrogen and oxygen, two things that are great for burning. So not a good idea to put, if you put water on a magnesium fire, all you do is like throwing fuel on a fire. So how about beryllium borings? What's the problem with beryllium? Very toxic, so that's a toxic issue. They didn't want to be regulated as scrap metal. Any metal contaminated with a hazardous waste. So you can't use scrap metal to get rid of your hazardous waste, such that the contaminated metal exhibits any hazardous waste characteristic or has free-flowing oil or any liquids on it. Scrap metal should be solids, not liquids. I got a scrap metal question?
Yeah. So I know we did a leak test on some scrap metal and it had chromium in it, and so they said it was considered a hazardous.
So she's asking, I had scrap metal and I did a test and it came back positive for chromium. So is it a hazardous waste? Not if it meets the definition of scrap metal. It's excluded. You don't have to do a waste determination as long as it meets this definition and it's not one of these. If it's this, it cannot be scrap metal. That doesn't mean you can't recycle it. You can't use the scrap metal exclusion.
Well, what about being contaminated with any hazardous waste? So chromium is considered a hazardous waste with that.
No, chromium is a metal. So she's asking, it's got chromium in it, you know, so it says contaminated with the hazardous waste. It would be a non-metal waste. So if it had something else on it that made it a hazardous waste, let's say it had cyanide salts on it. Cyanides are pretty dangerous, right? So if I had scrap metal with cyanide solids on there, I can't say that's scrap metal because the cyanides would fail the test for cyanide, not chromium. Chromium is a metal you would expect to have chromium in scrap metal. So that would not make it a hazardous waste. So just a picture of metal shavings. These are aluminum. How about this? This looks fairly safe, right? How safe does this look? And I saw somebody else was using this picture for a presentation today, so it's very popular. How about, is this being handled in a manner to protect the environment? Is it being handled as if it was a product, just being dumped to the land? So they're circuit boards, yes. And this was in China, I believe. So the stuff was going to China and it's just sitting on the ground and can leach into the ground. So as a generator, you're responsible if you're sending your waste off for recycling that it actually be recycled. And this was one of the issues. Legitimate recycling, shams and tars. Any recycling activity or claim must be legitimate. Cannot use recycling or reclamation as a sneaky way to get out of proper hazardous waste management. This happens all the time. People don't want to spend the money. They're looking at ways to save money. They come up with sham or tar type recycling. So the two concepts, tars, toxic along for the ride. We'll go through these. So TARs are when hazardous constituents in a waste stream are present in significant concentrations, regulatory levels, and yet have no beneficial or serve no purpose in the recycling process or product. Those constituents are essentially hazardous waste disposed of or treated through the recycling process. So remember my example of the nickel material that I had, and somebody was going to use it to make blueberry muffins. Is nickel an ingredient in blueberry muffins? So no, and the answer is no. So why would you be using that? That's a toxic along for the ride. So we've got some other examples at the end of the class that we'll talk about where people wanted to do recycling, but they weren't addressing the hazards of the material, and thus it was a toxic along for the ride. A sham is if there is no real value to the recycled product, no market for the material, or the material is to be used as an ingredient, etc., is not used consistent with the material it is replacing, it may be sham recycling. So you're just trying to get rid of it through some method, and there's no real market for what you're creating. So you're creating a product, but if there's no market for that product, you're not really recycling it, right? None of the waste has gone away. It's still there, and it's not being used for anything beneficial. So two big terms, toxics along for the ride and sham recycling. Both of these are heavily addressed by US EPA because they've dealt with this a lot. Indications of sham recycling. Secondary material is ineffective or only marginally affected for the claimed use. Secondary material is used in excess of the amount necessary, so they're basically trying to get rid of the stuff. Secondary material is not as effective as the raw material. So maybe, we can add 3%, but if we add more 3%, then the material's ruined. Well, why is it ruined? Because this stuff is not good for it. So, they're basically, if we only add 3%, we can get rid of it, but if we add more, we can't make a good product. So that tells you that there's something wrong with it as an ingredient. It should probably be 0%. There are no records, contractual, technical, financial regarding the recycling transaction, so they can't document any of it. Secondary material is not handled like a valuable commodity. So they expect you to handle the materials as if it has value, because if you're making a product, it should have value. Burden of proof is on the generator. Is there a market for the materials? Did the generator reuser meet the terms of the exclusion? If recycled on site, does the generator possess on-site recycling equipment? If off-site, does the reuser possess the requisite equipment? So you need to be able to demonstrate that it's actually being recycled. And we've got our forms. We're going to talk later on these forms, but there are areas in here, sham. So you need to say what are you making, how it's effective. And the TARs, La Brea tar pits, pretty good. So for the TARs, you need to say, what the hazards are and what they are after you've recycled it. So we're going to get into the primary recycling, reclamation, exemptions, exclusions.